Licínia Simão, профессор факультета международных отношений Коимбрского университета, Португалия. Занимается исследованиями в Центре социальных исследований в этом же университете, изучением вопросов мира и безопасности с особым упором на ситуации на Южном Кавказе и в Центральной Азии. Работает над европейской внешней политикой. Автор многих научных публикаций. Licínia Simão подготовила исследования для Министерства иностранных дел Великобритании, Европейского парламента и инициативы по миротворчеству. В настоящее время находится в Абхазии в рамках проекта по сотрудничеству между АГУ и Открытым университетом Брюсселя.
Мой первый вопрос. Я хотела бы услышать ваше собственное мнение о целях евроинтеграции.
Thank you very much for your question. I think the first target is economic. So this was the beginning of the European Union project. The European Union needs to be a prosperous economic project and to provide security, stability, prosperity for its own citizens, and also be a driver of economic growth for the broader European space. I think on the top of that, historically, there have been many political visions as well. Can the European Union speak with one voice in foreign and security issues? Can it be also an actor for conflict resolution? Can it perhaps also have a role in solving or addressing broader international issues like climate change, like migration issues, food security? So I think there is a modest beginning with an economic project, but it's growing into a more political one, and we are, of course, in need of responsible and active international actors.
Многие политики и эксперты считают, что главная цель восточной политики Евросоюза и в целом Запада – это чистейшая геополитика, это ослабление России. Вы с этим согласны?
I wouldn't agree with that. I think European integration started focused mostly on the development of peace between two former enemies, so France and Germany, and that was the main goal. Creating a union of states that could also resist pressures from the communist bloc during the Soviet Union, of course, was also a goal, but the Cold War is over. And we live in a globalized context with many different challenges. So I couldn't agree that the European Union is a project to somehow counteract Russia. I do agree that there have been lack of interesting and creative solutions to a more profound and creative and constructive dialogue with Russia on both sides. So we actually need these interesting ideas to come through so that whatever project Russia has for itself and for its neighbors is also somehow compatible.
Но как взорвавшаяся бомба информация о том, что американские спецслужбы подслушивали все это время руководителей стран Евросоюза. Как вы думаете, это не трещина в отношениях между Евросоюзом и США?
I think the Snowden affair, as it's known now, raises many issues to how private information is used by our governments. In this case, it was the United States governments, but I don't believe that they are the only ones doing this. So I think many of our governments have used these new technologies to instrumentalize this information in their own benefit. So I hope, again, that this is clarified, but this is a problem also for U.S. citizens, not only because the United States were not only listening to European leaders, but listening to their own citizens. So I think what we need to be aware is of the consequences that new technologies can have on the privacy of citizens and how far governments can go in intruding in our lives. I think that's
То, что произошло в Вильнюсе, то, что Украина не подписала соглашение об ассоциации с Евросоюзом, это поражение Евросоюза на этом этапе.
I would say, and this is a very European perspective, it's a failure for Ukraine. especially because there were some important steps taken before to prepare the country for that specific path. And going back on that decision has costs for Ukraine, most of all. I hope this is also an opportunity to revise whatever preoccupations the Ukrainian government has about the specific agreement, and perhaps an opportunity for the EU and Russia to, on a bilateral level between the two of them, address the concerns of Ukraine that it might be placed in an irreconcilable position between the two actors. So I think we need the economists to come and to explain why the customs union and the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU are not compatible. I believe that they may be in many ways. And we need more information to the citizen so that we don't form an opinion on myths, but we actually know what is going on and what the papers actually say. Yeah.
Наши телезрители с большим интересом ждут вашей лекции. Удачи вам! И снова кафедра лекции на абхазском телевидении. 28 ноября в Вильнюсе, столице Литвы, открылся саммит Восточного партнерства. Во время официальной церемонии были парафированы соглашения об ассоциации Евросоюза с Грузией и Молдовой. Кроме того, было подписано соглашение об упрощении визового режима между Азербайджаном и Евросоюзом. И только Украина не подписала соглашение об ассоциации с Европейским Союзом. Сегодня эта тема самая жаркая. Украина бурлит. И чем закончатся Евромайданы на Украине, никто не знает. Сегодня у нас на кафедре очень актуальная тема. Лекцию читает гость нашей программы, профессор факультета международных отношений университета Коимбра, Португалия, Licínia Simão. Добро пожаловать!
So, dear professors, dear students, dear guests, I would like to start by, of course, thanking the Abkhazian State University for hosting me over the last 2 weeks and for giving me the chance to teach a short course on the European Union, neighborhood policy, and the Eastern Partnership. And I would like to thank very specially this invitation to talk to you about these topics today and about the European Union's vision towards its Eastern neighbors, the proposals that it has developed, and the challenges that it faces. I understand, as was mentioned, that this is a topic of great current interest, and therefore I'm very honored and very pleased to share with you my thoughts on this matter. Since this has been a subject of my academic work, I hope to be able to clarify some of your many questions, which are also raised by the complex nature of the European Union integration and the multi-layered and interdependent issues faced by its foreign policy towards the countries of the former Soviet space. So I would like to call your attention to the first slide. So the title of my presentation, Europe Whole and Free Once More, the European Union and the Eastern Neighbors. Some of you may recognize this expression, whole and free, as it was often articulated by policymakers in the United States and in Europe in their vision for Europe. The main idea, especially in the vision for Europe after the Cold War ended. The main idea of this concept relates to the desire of reuniting the European continent, which, it was argued, had been artificially divided by the Cold War. With the end of the Warsaw Pact and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, this was seen not only as a possibility, but many in the West and East regarded it as a responsibility to reunite the European continent. Certainly, in Central and Eastern Europe, this idea was a clear priority in the foreign policy agendas of these countries. Thus, the abolition of these division lines of the continent entailed a proactive policy of enlargement of the Euro-Atlantic institutions, meaning here, of course, the European Union, but also NATO. In fact, as soon as 1993, in the Copenhagen European Council, the then 15 member states of the European Union agreed to enlarge the EU and to the Central and Eastern European countries. And by doing so, they established a set of accession criteria. So these were conditions that the future member states would have to comply to in order to be allowed into the European Union. And they began with this a process of close interaction led by the European Commission, who was monitoring and developing this process. And the ultimate goal of this process, I would say, was the reforming of the political domestic institutions of these countries, but also of their economic institutions. So political and economic reform. But also there was on the agenda a concern with issues of foreign policy, as these countries were expected to develop good neighborly relations with the countries around them. So this is the agenda that is on the table, that was on the table for the enlargement to Central and Eastern European countries. So why did I decide to go back to this, by now, a distant period in history? More than 20 years have passed, and since the process was initiated, and next year, the Central and Eastern European countries will celebrate their 10th anniversary of membership to the European Union. Are there lessons that can be learned from this process that are useful to help us understand how the European Union sees its relations with its eastern neighbors? I would like to make the argument today here that unlike in the 1990s, the Union today lacks a clear vision of what it can, of how it can develop its relations with the former Soviet countries. And there are several reasons why the EU lacks this clear vision, and why the concept of Europe whole and free is no longer a sufficient explanation for the Union's views. However, I would also like to make the argument that this concept is still remarkably a powerful idea, which commands a great deal of influence and power to the European Union's foreign policy towards these countries. So my proposal is that we see how this concept and this vision have been re-articulated under this neighborhood policy, and look at the many challenges that it faces and which have become clearly visible in the last week's Vilnius summit and with Ukraine's suspension of the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement and the association agreement with the EU, as well as with Armenia's decision to join the customs union with Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, rather than pursuing the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union. So, as we are faced with these very empirical challenges, I think it is important to use this reference of the enlargement, of the reunification of the continent, to see whether it still gives us a good conceptual basis to address the current relations of the EU and its neighbors. So we need the second one rather than the last one. You can go up, yes. Yes. Technology always creates problems when we least expect it. There you go. So, a map of the European Union, just to remind us exactly what we are talking about. Okay? As of July this year, the European Union now has 28 member states, except for Norway and Switzerland. Most of the Western European countries are in. And then, as you know, there are accession perspectives for the countries in the Western Balkans. Croatia was the first one to enter the European Union. There is Turkey also, with an accession process with its many problems. And for the remaining countries around the EU developed this neighborhood policy. Russia has a special position here. Russia did not want to be part of this neighborhood policy, and so the European Union and Russia developed what they call a strategic partnership based on 4 roadmaps, and they therefore have a different political framework for their relationship than have the rest of the countries. Then the countries in the neighborhood policy are Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova, and Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan in the South Caucasus to the east, and then to the south as well, the countries in North Africa and the Middle East. So this is a broad group of countries, very different countries as well, gathered under this common framework of developing closer relations between the EU and the neighbors. During preparations of the EU's enlargement in 2004, the concerns of the European nations and of the European institutions, such as the European Commission, which was very much involved in the process, were centered mostly, I would say, on the ability of the Union to incorporate or absorb these 10 new member states. Romania and Bulgaria entered in 2008, as I have mentioned. The Western Balkans and Turkey are also on the pipeline for accession. The impact of this enlargement on the European institutions, of course, it was a serious concern. Would the Union still be able to make decisions in the many complex and expanding areas of European integration? Would it still be able to speak with only one voice in foreign and security issues? Could it still develop a common view of how the European project should be defined? And not least, would it have the financial resources and the economic dynamism needed to support the social and economic development of the new member states? It was decided that the costs of not enlarging to these countries would be much higher than the costs of enlargement. And so there was a commitment to this so-called Big Bang enlargement with 10 new member states entering the Union in 2004. This decision can also be seen as a normative view of enlargement. What does this mean? It means that enlargement is seen also as a policy to provide security to Europe, and this was, of course, more powerful than the risks that it involved for the Union. In fact, the enlargement policy has been named the EU's most successful foreign policy and has been seen as a fundamental approach to providing security in Europe. This is done by transforming the neighboring societies to the EU's image, developing more predictable relations and stable dynamics in its neighboring context. I would also like to underline that for the enlargement process of the EU, the support of the United States and NATO was fundamental to the success of this policy. As successive U.S. administrations regarded the inclusion of the Central and Eastern European countries into Euro-Atlantic institutions as the best policy for contributing to security in Europe, and in the process reduce the influence of Russia in the region. The context in the 1990s was also favorable because these were years of economic growth in Europe. Also, there was increasing domestic support for European integration in these countries, and in cases where undemocratic regimes were in place, domestic pressures for democratization helped their inclusion into the EU and NATO. And finally, another important factor is that during the 1990s, Russia was also very much concerned with its own domestic instability and was at the time unable to prevent the full integration of these countries into the Euro-Atlantic structures. So as the enlargement of the EU came closer, concerns about the negative impact in neighboring countries and the lack of a strategy towards the former Soviet Union became part of the EU's thinking. The most active advocates of the need of a new policy of the Union for these countries were the new member states, including the Baltic states, Poland and the Czech Republic, Romania afterwards as well. At least two main concerns were voiced. by these states. First, there was a genuine concern with cross-border cooperation, which would be now hampered by the new EU border after enlargement. So in the Polish-Ukrainian border, where there were traditionally easy cross-border cooperations, people would now have to apply for new visas. There were more strict visa controls. We were also assisting to the process of trade diversion. So the Polish trade was much more intensive now with other EU countries. And so what effect would this have on the Ukrainian or Belarusian economies, for instance? People on their daily interactions across the border would feel a difference after the enlargement. And so this was something that the new member states were very much concerned with and wanted the EU to have a policy to minimize these negative impacts. The second concern had to do with the reassertion of Russian influence in its near abroad under President Vladimir Putin. Here, the Baltic states were also concerned that without EU strategy towards Ukraine and Georgia, especially after their so-called color revolutions, the EU would fail to reinforce its strategic position as a relevant security actor in its regional context. In a way, we can say that, much like Russia saw itself as having particular responsibilities in its near abroad, the EU was also interested in influencing its neighboring countries. So despite the differences of approaches, and despite the statements by EU officials that the Union was not interested in notions of spheres of influence, the logics were remarkably similar and presented in mutually exclusive ways. In fact, there were significant divisions among EU member states as to the approach that should be taken towards the neighbors. So take, for instance, these statements. So this is a statement by a French diplomat. And he states that the choice for the European Union is not between Russia and its neighbors. By the same logic, the choice is not for these countries to be either in the European or in the Russian sphere d'influence. So this is a French diplomat. Clearly, France cherishes very much the relationship with Russia and understood that such rivalry with Russia would be counterproductive. And finding a balance between these interests and views was, of course, the preferred approach in this case. The second statement was made by the Polish commissioner in 2006, and she states that the debate on the frontiers of Europe is rarely about geography, ethnography, or even history, as normal people would expect. It is usually about foreign policy, security, governance, and unfortunately sometimes about prejudice. And she continued, I am convinced that the Union must keep its doors open to European countries which are not yet members. There may be an alternative to membership, of course, which will satisfy some of these states, but excluding some countries by artificially drawing the frontiers of Europe will only create frustration and problems for the future. I hardly dare mention the word Yalta in this context. The statement is not only an exhortation to EU member states to continue committed to future enlargements, thus expanding the influence of the Union, but it is also a warning that by artificially defining a final border for the EU, we might empower Russia to become more assertive towards these countries. We would thus be accepting Russia's sphere of influence by refusing to enlarge our own. It is hard to underestimate how powerful these arguments still are among many European countries. A resurgent Russia, both in economic and military terms, who has established its influence in many areas of the former Soviet countries and whose leadership is, of course, not shy about using such leverages, certainly contributes to these fears. Moreover, and this is for me the most important aspect, in the absence of a true partnership between the European Union and Russia, competition is likely to be the result, as the two actors fail to agree on mutual interests and mutual commitments. So, what is then fundamentally different from the European Union's approach to the future member states and the neighbors, which for the foreseeable future will not be included in the EU? There are, first of all, many similarities in the approach that the EU designed, either because the European Union officials designing this neighborhood policy were the same people that were previously designing the enlargement policy, and therefore their mind frame is the same and their experiences were the same, or because this was also a deliberate strategy by the European Union to keep what they call a constructive ambiguity in the final outcome of this neighborhood policy. If we look at this statement by the former European Commission President Romano Prodi, he stated that the ENP, the neighborhood policy, was more than partnership and less than membership, offering neighbors the sharing of everything with the Union but institutions. And he continued, what is attractive about such offer? The aim is to extend to this neighboring region a set of principles, values and standards which define the very essence of the European Union. He was, of course, unable to clarify what type of new political relations would be developed under these common values and principles, but was clearly indicating that the neighbors should be given access to the many EU programs and policies, although they would not be able to be taken as members of the Union for now. A first step to clarify these new relations was the celebration of bilateral action plans between the European Union and the states in the neighborhood. Under these action plans, it became clear what this new relationship would be like. And a series of reforms were agreed, giving meaning to this new partnership and clarifying how the EU values should be expanded to the neighboring regions. This focused on, first of all, democratic reforms. Second, the promotion and the protection of human rights. Third, the rule of law and good governance, fight against corruption, and economic liberalization as the final element of these action plans. These measures are also the minimum requirements for accession to the EU, and were also required of the neighboring countries if they were to benefit from the EU's programs and assistance. For instance, from 2007 to 2013, the EU allocated more than 12 billion euros to this collaboration with the neighbors and developed custom-made reforms focusing on specific needs of the partners. For instance, the EU designed a partnership for institution building with Armenia, improving the way the public institutions in Armenia work, modernizing them and making them more accountable. The EU also signed, for instance, a memorandum of understanding on energy cooperation with Azerbaijan, of course a natural priority in their relations. And the EU supported, for instance, the Ukrainian goal of accession to the World Trade Organization. So you see that the EU also tried in this collaboration to adjust to the different needs and different priorities defined by the neighboring countries. Under the Eastern Partnership, which is the eastern dimension of the neighborhood policy, the EU has also presented the neighbors with new political agreements, these association agreements that we have been hearing about. These agreements build on these commitments that I mentioned of the action plan, so democratic reforms, human rights, good governance, fight against corruption, economic liberalization as well, and also include issues such as cooperation on justice, freedom and security. Here we mean border controls, illegal migration, terrorism, organized crime, but also cooperation and reforms in transport, energy, information society, so new technologies for communication, environment, research and innovation, and people-to-people contact, so here mobility programs for students, journalists, and others. This is a broad partnership with many areas covered that could present important improvements for both sides. In fact, the text of these association agreements is not yet available, so we can't actually have access to it to know exactly what is there. And we can only speculate on this based on the action plans and based also on the association agreements that were signed with the Central and Eastern European countries and which were the base for future membership. Naturally, the most important offer that was on the table, and still is the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement that we also have been hearing a lot about. This would cover not only liberalization in more sectors of the economy, so not just in goods, but also services, capital, and so on, and would address barriers to economic integration besides tariff duties. So we are talking about the substantive offer here, and it's the possibility of having access to the dynamic and rich market of the European Union, which, despite the economic and financial crisis that we are going through, is still one of the most interesting and appealing for producers. I would add one final aspect that is also on the table, which is access to funding for infrastructural development by the World Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, as well as the creation of an investment facility specifically dedicated to the neighboring countries. So combined, these increases in funding actually offer important possibilities for structural development of these economies and societies. I would say that these are not minor offers, and they are relevant in the context of development of these states, and so they are supposed to make a difference also in the political relations that follow afterwards. So in exchange for this support, the EU expected certain conditions to be fulfilled. In fact, the focus on democracy, human rights, and rule of law should hardly be contested in countries which are also members of the Council of Europe and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which all of these countries are. We can certainly agree that the lack of consolidated democratic and transparent institutions is part of the reason why the economies of these countries fail to prosper. Or when they do, like in the case of Azerbaijan and Ukraine, at least until the financial crisis in 2008, they benefit only a small elite that controls political power. Without democratic accountability and freedom of speech, the redistribution of wealth by the state benefits only a few, leaving millions still in poverty and disenfranchised. Moreover, I would also argue that the lack of democracy hampers the peaceful resolution of existing conflicts. In authoritarian contexts, where there is no room for concessions to the former enemy, the peace processes are bound to be frozen, and those who dare to support a policy of mutual concessions are characterized as traitors or even worse, foreign agents. Only in truly democratic contexts can the voices of peace feel free to challenge the state policies on the conflicts, including also the use of the very limited national resources for military development rather than socio-economic progress. Democracy is thus, in my view, correctly seen by the EU as a fundamental step for long-term peace and stability in the former Soviet countries, and especially, I would say, in the South Caucasus. That the EU should make its assistance conditional to these reforms seems to me quite sensitive and sensible. The EU needs, nevertheless, to be consistent in its normative commitment and engage in all meaningful areas of partners' national priorities if it is to be taken as a reliable partner. Economic liberalization, however, is more contested. The policies of aggressive liberalization have been denounced by many academics working, for instance, on development and cooperation. You have probably heard this, that during the 1980s, the International Monetary Fund's structural adjustment programs sought to reform many African and Latin American states as part of their lending programs, under the promise that their economies would be more competitive in the international markets, and this would lift millions out of poverty. Among these reforms were the priorities of reducing state budgets, which usually were directed at social spending, such as salaries for public servants, pensions and unemployment benefits, as well as education and health services, which now would have to be privatized. And the results were catastrophic for many of these societies, and the levels of poverty rose sharply among the least protected segments of these societies. These states and the international community as a whole failed to protect the most vulnerable, and in the process allowed for massive accumulation of capital in the hands of a few. This same recipe is now being applied to the southern European countries like Greece, Portugal, and Spain. Why do I refer to this process? I believe that it is in the interest of the people in all Europe to fight for a more sustainable economic model, where the benefits of capitalism and open market competition can be harmonized with social protection and a regulatory role for the state. This was the European view on capitalism, which only gradually has been infused by more neoliberal views. European elites, therefore, in my view, need to be reminded of the catastrophic consequences of aggressive capitalism in terms of the levels of poverty, in terms of xenophobic ideals and aggressive nationalisms. If Europe can afford to be solidary in times of wealth, it has a special responsibility to promote solidarity in times of economic hardship. This is also true for its relations with the countries with whom it's negotiating these deep and comprehensive free trade agreements. This would be fundamental to dissipate fears that the EU would use these agreements to flood the Ukrainian market with cheap products, or that many jobs would be lost and many small businesses would close. This is a reasonable concern by the Ukrainians and needs to be addressed seriously. Migration issues are, of course, another important aspect of these relations. And in times of crisis, migrants usually are the first targets of xenophobic discourse and actions. Take the examples coming from Russia. But take, for instance, also what is happening in the United Kingdom or Italy or in other countries. No country is really free from these dynamics. We are all living in multi-ethnic societies and countries under the age of globalization. If migrants are welcomed in times of economic prosperity, when the low-paid jobs are no longer wanted by the local population, they should also be cherished in times of hardship. The prospects of having visa facilitation for the citizens of the countries of the Eastern Partnership are certainly a welcome development. But this does not mean that people from these countries cannot travel to Europe right now. Visas are available for tourism or to study. What we are actually discussing here is making the process faster, cheaper, and more human, so that people do not have to wait for weeks for an answer and might have the possibility to work in the European Union if so they choose to do. In this regard, the spheres of influence discourse is not the most suitable. Economic development does not need to come from one direction only. Social development does not need to be linked only to one country or group of countries. And in many areas, the offers made available by the EU and Russia to these countries are truly compatible. The understanding that economic integration can be manipulated for political purposes certainly is reminiscent of the Cold War days, when one of the two powers dominated over a group of smaller states, limiting their choices. The challenges we face today are too complex and urgent to be compatible with such narrow views of international relations. Both the EU and Russia have, in my view, an obligation to cooperate to make life in Europe more peaceful and prosperous. At the Vilnius summit, it became clear that the EU failed to convince its partners in the eastern neighborhood that the project it was offering was a significant better option than Russia's. Moreover, it mainly failed to show how the two projects could be made mutually beneficial. But as you know, it takes two to tango, so we would need a similar approach on the other side. As we have seen during the last days in Ukraine, many people in the country believe that President Yanukovych's decision has deprived them of a choice. In fact, one must ask in whose interest this decision was taken. What are the costs involved both in the short and in the long term for Ukraine? Regardless of what happens in Ukraine in the coming days, the EU needs to rethink its approach to its neighbors, because in the absence of membership perspectives, the EU can in fact be in the danger of becoming only a common market if it continues to enlarge. How can its foreign policy still provide benefits for its neighbors and partners? How can it engage with Russia in some of the challenges in these countries? Among these, conflict resolution is certainly the most important. Either ignoring the negative consequences of the conflicts or using them for political purposes is, in my view, an immoral foreign policy, unethical and blind to the human consequences it can inflict. No one should be happy with the status quo. In my view, we need either a more coherent, determined and responsible EU, or a more realist and pragmatic one who understands the limits of its actions and seeks to avoid tensions and divisions, which it then cannot or is not willing to address. As I personally believe Europe is still not irrelevant, and that it can be a force for good in international relations, I hope European leaders can be more determined in their engagement with the Eastern neighbors, including all of the societies in the South Caucasus. This might lead to a new interpretation of what it means to create a new Europe whole and free, where all have a voice and a place. So thank you very much for your attention.
Two questions. The first one about the United States. What was the advantages to help the United States to support the creation of the European Union? And the second question is about Greece. How the situation
So if I understood correctly, the first one, you want to know the advantages for the United States of helping the EU. I think this question comes from this first introduction about how the United States was so engaged in Europe after the Cold War and how it supported the enlargement of the European Union and NATO. There is a natural connection, if you want, or a close political relationship between the United States and Europe. You can argue that this relationship comes from shared values and shared views about the world. We can argue that. We can also argue that it's a strategic partnership that brings benefits to everyone. The United States and the economic countries are the most economic economies in the world. They are very relevant markets, so having close relations, of course, makes perfect sense for them as well. They are, in fact, just negotiating a new free trade agreement between the European Union and the United States, reinforcing this partnership. So I think for the United States, consolidating and stabilizing Europe is always a priority, or at least Europeans like to think so and hope it stays that way. We can see that, for instance, that the United States were very much engaged in addressing the conflicts in the Balkans in the 1990s because the Europeans were unable to address and stop the conflicts. So the US presence there was fundamental. We know as well that US support for EU enlargement was very important. So I think we can see this still from the EU perspective and the EU member states' perspective. the US is still one of the superpowers. It's still the most powerful military actor in the world. It's a fundamental international economy. And so to have the support of this big power behind EU policies always makes a difference. From the point of view of the United States, I would say that there is an interest as well in keeping Europe stable and peaceful and prosperous, because they are natural partners. As regards Greece, Greece, like Portugal, living very difficult days. I've spoken about this economic project and approach, which I think is very limited and should be revised. I think that these austerity measures that are being imposed in exchange for assistance, for financial assistance, are destroying in many ways the social conditions in these countries. And Greece is, of course, in such a situation. And also we see in Greece the rise of these nationalist, fascist regimes and movements. And these are very much of concern to me, because we should fight these tendencies every time we encounter them. And this has to do with the poor economic conditions right now that the country is living. So the EU is providing immediate financial relief, and the European Union has created an instrument of stability that funds these institutions, these countries that are in trouble. But in the process of doing that, it's demanding a very high price. Of course, we can say it's the European Union who is demanding the price, but we can also say that it is, of course, those who are now crediting us, who are lending the money. So the IMF as well is involved, and the European Commission, and the Central European Bank, so it's that called Troika. So I think, although immediate financial support was needed, we also have to pay attention to the social conditions, because this can have very negative political effects in Europe. And I hope this is the voices of those who want a different model will be heard as well. I hope that the democratic context of the EU will allow these voices to make a difference. Yeah.
You describe mostly the advantages of being in European Union, and as we all know, there are some problems within the Union, and there are some opinions that a European Union will, in the near future, face the destiny of Soviet Union. It will fall apart, and for example, Greece, as we know. It's some moods in Greece that they want to leave EU, and I want to know your opinion about that matter, and how can you describe the future of European Union? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Difficult questions, of course. I think I was also very critical of the European Union, and I also underline many of the difficulties of being inside such a union. So I don't think I only focused on the advantages. How can the EU overcome this crisis without losing meaning and purpose? I think the union started as an economic project, and slowly it grew into more of a political actor. But it's still a very disarticulated one, with 28 member states each having a voice in the European Council and the Council of Ministers. And then there's also a commission that has its own prerogatives. So sometimes we have decisions at the European level, and sometimes some decisions have to be a consensus among all the member states. So this is hard for any political system or institution, if you want, to work like that. But I think it also gives flexibility. Because if you are a flexible project that can adjust, that can advance in some areas and stay a little bit more stopped in others because there is no agreement, then in a way or another you find room for everyone inside. So in that sense, my hope is that because the EU is not a typical state like the ones we have in the international system, and has created this flexible and more varied institutional context for itself, that it will be able to overcome some of these difficulties. And I would say that maybe 2 years ago in Europe we were also considering, will the EU survive this crisis? And I work in European studies, maybe I should be looking for a new job. So I think we are now off the woods. I think Europe is again going into a path of economic recovery. Politically has made some interesting and important reforms that it needed to do, namely regarding the economic governance of the EU, which is now more articulated at the European level. Because these global crises, demand a response that is truly regional and strong, not to mention global. So if the EU can speak with one voice on these issues, I think it's better prepared. What my concern is on the political front, on the political project. Because many times what you see is a political manipulation of the crisis or the lack of response by domestic politicians who blame the European Union for everything that is bad in their countries. We know the strategy. Of course, for the citizen, what it listens to is everything that is bad comes from Brussels. We many times forget that many good things come from Brussels as well. Because this is a domestic strategy for many domestic national leaders that do this. And this is the case, for instance, in the United Kingdom, where there's such an Eurosceptic trend, but also in Greece now and in other contexts. So I think people need to be more informed about how the European Union works. There should be more democratic participation by the citizens in the European Union so that they know directly that they are influencing some of these decisions. And I think Europe should go back to its fundamental principles: democracy, human rights, and rule of law, and be consistent in their domestic application of these principles as well. I think with this we'll be okay. So I don't think it will have the same result as the Soviet Union.
Hi.
Hello.
I just want to say thanks for your presentation, and my question is, why is Abkhazia interesting for European Union in your opinion?
So why is Abkhazia interesting for the European Union? I think, I just had that question yesterday. I think the question is the other way around. What is Abkhazia's interest in the European Union? And I'm going to explain why I think the more relevant question is this one. If you look at the international system, you have many big states, many big powers, and many small states and territories who, for one reason or another, need some sort of change in their context. To have the attention of big powers, you need to be relevant for some reason. Because you are important for their energy security, because you are important for economic development, because you pose a threat of some kind, because you are a strategic partner of some kind. And I don't think Abkhazia is neither of these things for the EU right now. Having said that, I do think there are many areas where the EU should be more involved. And I mentioned in my talk that ignoring the conflicts that exist around us is not, in my view, an ethical foreign policy, as it's not ethical to instrumentalize them for political purposes. So having said that, I think the EU has a normative obligation to get engaged, but I think it's much more important for Abkhazians to define what they want from the EU and to tell that straight to the EU's face in a pragmatic and cooperative manner, and find ways to cooperate. I think it's in some ways easier for the initiative to come from this side. And that's the best answer I can give you. I hope you're satisfied. I think you need the microphone.
First of all, let me thank you for a very interesting presentation. And I would like to ask you, with these recent events in Ukraine and this situation, and the further cooperation readiness of European Union to cooperate with Ukraine, the British Prime Minister expressed a statement that they were concerned about this new Europe and there is a possibility for United Kingdom to leave European Union. So what is it, this new Europe? Has it changed the priorities since its creation? And is this possibility is real for United Kingdom to leave European Union? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, before the Lisbon Treaty came into force, there was no clause in the European treaties that allowed a country to leave the Union. Everyone always understood that under international law, any state can leave any organization that it's part of. So that's a prerogative of the states. Under the Lisbon Treaty, a special article has been created that says and creates a process through which a member state can leave the Union. So we actually now have an institutionalized process if one member wants to leave the Union. This is just to clarify how it could be done. Is the UK going to leave the European Union? You would have some people saying, yes, please let them go fast so that we can finally go on with the political project of deep integration that we want and that they keep saying no to. Okay, so this would be the more French view that has a specific vision of how the European Union could be developing. And others would say, but what sort of political actor will the European Union be without the United Kingdom? He's a major military power, a major international player, a major financial player as well. What sort of international actor would this European Union be without the UK? Either way, I think there are possibilities, with or without the United Kingdom. So I don't think the European Union would end if the UK decided to leave. Having said that, I don't think the UK is going anywhere. There has been a lot of Eurosceptic trends in the United Kingdom for a long time. They are actually represented in the European Parliament. And this is always, with varying degrees, a presence in the official discourse of the United Kingdom. That sometimes the European Union does too much, that the Commission extends its prerogatives and its powers beyond what it should do. The United Kingdom is has been one of the major blockers of a stronger cooperation in defense issues. It was only when they were on board of this that we actually managed to develop a common security and defense policy. I think the UK is going through a very strong economic crisis as well. And it's very reluctant to respond to that crisis in the European context. We've seen the consequences of this crisis in this speech against migrants, which I totally and utterly reject. I don't think it represents the view of Europe on the migrants. If anything, it's a view of a minority inside the United Kingdom, with many others raising their voices to say they are not in favor of this policy at all. We have seen it in this resistance to be on board of the new governance structures that the European Union is developing. So the United Kingdom, for instance, is not part of the latest intergovernmental treaty that the European Union signed. So are they going to leave the EU? Maybe yes, maybe no, we don't know. Maybe with a new leadership, a new discourse will come. We don't know that either. I think this concern with Ukraine, or that Ukraine might become the next Romania or something like that, if it's true and if it's being articulated, I think it's a minority of the views in Europe. It's not the majority for sure. And I mentioned this today, that Ukraine is certainly not Romania, and there are many, many differences between the two countries and between the size of the economy in Ukraine and the ability of Ukraine to produce its own jobs and prosperity. So I don't think you would see even more such significant flows of migrants to the other European Union countries. I don't know. I think the investment should be in providing wealth in these countries, first of all. So I hope the EU manages, again, this new, more balanced economic view, or to somehow adjust these deep and comprehensive free trade agreements so that it promotes growth, sustainable growth. As for the UK, they sometimes do these things. We shouldn't pay too much attention to these narratives as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving such an opportunity to learn something about the European Union and its policy. And as being one of your students for a week and a half, maybe our knowledge is much maybe better of the others on this issue. And as you said many times during our lections, that if you have a problem, the best way to solve it is to put it on the agenda. So my question is, what is the best way for our independent state of Abkhazia to put ourselves on the European agenda and to make us more visible? So maybe the attitude of the European Union will change in a few years. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we should stay with the question. No, it's true. So I've said this, that if you want the European Union's attention, then you need to demand something. You need to ask for something. You need to let people know about your problems and your issues and how they can help us or help you with these issues. What do you expect from others? I think starting with the issue of recognition of independence might be a problematic start. Because it raises, as you know, many, many issues for Europe that I think they are not ready to address. Starting on more low-level, less political issues might actually be very interesting and might actually make your lives, in many ways, much safer and much more with better opportunities. So I'm thinking that, and I know this has been proposed to the youth, so many of these things need to be now on the other side also taken on board. And this is why I say that you need to have several interlocutors in Brussels, in this complex structure that is the European Union. So dialogue is the means, as far as I can see, to get more things done. You need to tell your story to more people so that more people will be engaged in your narrative. Education projects, of course, is something that we can do. It doesn't require recognition at the political level. It requires goodwill and openness for dialogue. Me coming here is part of such an interesting project. Helping people improve their health conditions, that is also something that would make a difference in your lives and doesn't require international recognition. Or improving water quality, or diminishing criminality, or there are so many interesting things that could improve human security, the security of the people, without in any way, I think, undermining the security of the state. In fact, I think that a state and a government that provides good quality life for its citizens is the best way to assure legitimacy and to be seen as a strong state. So improving your lives is, I think, the obligation of your government, as improving my life is the obligation of my government, and so on. So I think that if cooperating with the EU on these low-level issues improves the quality of your life, great. Good start. If this also helps the EU to know more about you and about your problems, about your needs, and to see in the Abkhazians a reliable partner with whom they can work, this can only be beneficial for the future. So I think starting with the high political level is not the best way. And starting with low politics, the low issues, and then building up might be a much more interesting approach.
We clearly know that EU has good relations with Georgia, and we want to know your opinion. How do you think this conflict can be resolved, and what policy should Georgia lead in this situation? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. But I can't really answer for Georgians. You know that. I don't have an answer for your very hard question. If I did, I would win the Nobel Peace Prize. Right? Look, again, The only thing that I think is a positive start is dialogue, because only through dialogue can peace arrive. And only through dialogue can we prevent war from coming into our lives again. So that's as far as I can go, saying that in any situation, dialogue is always better than not having any communication at all. And from there we go, after an honest dialogue. So that would be my very, very limited contribution to that.
Hello, I'm a second-year student and I'd like to thank you for a very interesting lecture. So my question, what are the main criteria to join the European Union? In your own opinion, what are the future prospects of this union?
Okay. Okay, so the criteria to join the union. As I mentioned, in 1993 was the first time that the European Union members decided that there should be objective criteria written down somewhere so that states knew whether they would be allowed in or not. There are three main criteria, four I would say. So you need to be a democratic state with consolidated democratic institutions. You need to protect and promote human rights. Okay? And you need to have rule of law. So this means that relations in society are managed and regulated by written laws with courts, tribunals that can apply that law. Independent courts that can apply that law independently of the political sphere. Okay? So rule of law is fundamental here. And then there is another criteria, which is states need to be market economies. So there is an ideological economic vision for this European integration. They need to be market economies who are capable to support the pressures of open market competition inside the European Union common market. So it means that you need to be a well-structured economy because you are entering a very competitive market. And so only when you are capable of supporting these pressures of the competitive market, then you are prepared to fully enter, like you hit the ground running, right? You're ready to, without having too many negative consequences. The process of being a member means that there is gradual opening and liberalization. You liberalize as you are prepared. So these are the four main criteria. The other criteria which is written in the treaties, is that you need to be a European state. And that, of course, is a little bit of a Pandora box, because it opens a huge discussion with what is or who is an European state. Where do the borders of Europe finish to the east? And who decides that I'm European, but the country next door is no longer European? Is Europe a geographical issue? Is it a cultural issue? Is it an economic issue? A religious issue? How do we define an European? How do we know one when we see him or her? So this is actually a political decision. And that's why that remark by the Polish commissioner that usually the frontiers of Europe are defined by geography, culture, ethnography, but ultimately it's about foreign policy and political decisions. And as she mentioned, many times it's about prejudice. So is Ukraine European? Yes, of course, we would say yes. Ukraine is a very European state. European leaders have said that repeatedly, that Ukraine is not a neighbor of Europe. Ukraine is a European state. And so in that sense, Ukraine fulfills the first criteria to be considered for membership. It is a European state. Now, does it fulfill the others? One day we'll see. The major issue is, does it want to be a member state or not? And that is not clear. Prospects for the EU, let's see how this works. It's been working out more or less fine so far. I think what I appreciate most about this project is that it's an open project with room for everyone, with its many colors, shapes, sizes, whatever. And being an open and democratic project, I am hopeful that this will lead us into good things and that we'll be able to solve our differences in a peaceful way. So, I mean, in the complicated context which we live internationally, these, I think, are already very important goals to have. We shouldn't be too ambitious at some point. Yeah. Okay.
When you go in Brussels, how will you describe your trip experience in Abkhazia? For Abkhazia. Yeah.
When I go to Brussels.
Yeah.
If they invite me, I'll be happy to go to Brussels, yes. Right now I'm going to go back to Coimbra to teach next Monday morning. I don't know. Depends on the questions they ask me. But I'll be happy to talk about my experience here at the faculty and how interesting it was to teach these students. Very bright, very interested in wanting to know more. So I think, in a way, there is a lot of curiosity about the European Union. How does it work? What does it do? I think there is also a lot of room for collaborative projects here, like I mentioned in my previous answer. I will say that I was very well received with Caucasian hospitality. So, you know, I've been very pleased with my stay here. These 2 weeks has been really wonderful. So I have nothing bad to say about it.
I'd like to know if there is any threat that enlargement of the European Union can somehow destabilize the situation in the region and change the vision of people in Europe. Thank you.
So you want to know if there's a danger in a way that... There's always danger. I mean, I think the first risk, I would call it, is for the European Union itself. Like I mentioned, if the EU continues to enlarge, will it be able to be a political actor still, or is just, you know, a common market? And then there's no point in dreaming that it can be a political actor with a role in conflict resolution or a role in promoting environmental, fighting climate change or any other of these things. So that I think the first risk is for the EU, truly. I think it needs to rethink the project. Maybe we need to become more of a federation or something that is politically more articulated. I don't know. But these are different options that are on the table, and there is a lively debate in Europe right now as where should we go, what should we do? You know, crises always present us with opportunities as well to change the things that we don't think are so well. So perhaps this is also a good opportunity for Europe to be constructive and creative about the future. So I think that's the first risk. The second risk is that the EU promises something or creates illusions that then it cannot deliver. That's why I said it needs to be pragmatic and realistic. And be serious about its offer. And that's why I think the neighbors have not been given a membership perspective, because the EU is being responsible in that sense as well, not promising something that it knows right now it cannot deliver. It wouldn't be serious to tell Ukraine, we will get you in, because everyone agrees and we have the capacity to do it. Right now that's not possible. So the EU is actually very responsible not offering that. But as we have seen, the EU did follow through on its promise to Croatia. So this is a good sign that the European Union still has the capacity to take in new member states. Other member states like Macedonia and others are also somehow on the road to accession. We know Turkey is a complicated case for many, many reasons. So I think the EU needs to address these issues and be responsible. If it cannot enlarge, then it needs to find ways to promote still peace and security, which it is its main objective from the very beginning. The European Union was created as a peace project to bring French and German together under one collaborative idea. And if it can still do that, fine. If it can't do that through enlargement, then find other ways to enhance dialogue in its neighboring regions without creating too much tension. I agree that it's important for the EU to be aware of this. Yes. Yeah.
Насколько самостоятелен Евросоюз в отношениях с Соединенными Штатами Америки?
I think Europeans look at the United States as partners, and therefore there's dialogue. And in many things, especially related to military issues, they're not very independent. They depend on the United States for many of these issues. I think they try to have common goals rather than going against the United States, because they understand that there are risks for going against the United States. So are they not very independent? Maybe not, but sometimes they just see eye to eye, they agree, so they go the same way. But we have cases where Europe has taken a different road from the United States, like Iraq, for instance, in 2003. There was a clear split. So it's a sign that it's possible to be independent from the United States when we also make an effort to be so. Yeah.
Есть такая точка зрения, что внутри Европейского Союза есть главные страны, которые доминируют, а остальные страны, они как бы их обслуживают. Вы согласны с такой точкой зрения?
Yes. Yes, there are major players. The European Union is not devoid of power politics. So there are power differences inside the European Union. I think there are many instances when the small countries don't serve the interests of the bigger ones and actually make coalitions against the bigger ones. So I'm not sure that we can generalize an answer saying that yes, they always serve the interests of the bigger states. And sometimes they actually make coalitions of smaller states against these bigger states' interests.
Есть и такая точка зрения, что для Европы страны бывшего СССР, там, где традиционные интересы России, и Запад пытается использовать как рынок сбыта. Я хочу привести пример Игналинской электростанции Литвы в 1991 году. Многие противники евроинтеграции ссылаются и на этот факт. И таких фактов очень много.
Look, I've mentioned this in my presentation that I think the EU needs to be clear about this. And if the project is one of aggressive capitalism to come and flood these markets with cheap goods, then it's in no one's interest, because in the long term you will have high rates of unemployment and social problems. So I don't know if it is that or not. I am convinced that there is more to the EU's offer than just that.
Ну, извините, если четверть населения Литвы оказалась вне родины, вне Литвы, после того, как Литва вошла в Евросоюз, разве нет из-за безработицы и миграции? Она уже есть.
I don't know. I actually don't know the answer to that. But just to complete the answer before, I think it's also up to the governments of these states that are negotiating these deep and comprehensive free trade agreements, the post-Soviet countries, to make sure that that doesn't happen and that this is clear for their people.
Все-таки евроинтеграция – это экономическая модель или геополитический проект?
It started as an economic project and it may become a geopolitical project, a model of sorts.
Спасибо вам большое. Я думаю, что это живое общение, эта лекция будет интересна не только студентам, но и для широкой аудитории наших телезрителей. Я хочу сказать, что Абхазия не закрывается ни перед кем, в том числе, конечно, перед Европейским Союзом. Деятельность или участие Евросоюза в развитии Абхазии почти незаметно. Хорошо заметно, конечно, влияние и помощь, которая идет со стороны Российской Федерации. Что будет с этим миром дальше, трудно сказать. Вполне возможно, что продолжится европейская интеграция. Или, может быть, я бы это назвала бы евроатлантическая интеграция. В свое время, кстати говоря, де Голль считал необходимой как раз-таки евразийскую интеграцию. И я думаю, что во всем мире есть люди, которые поддерживают эту точку зрения. Но будет евразийская интеграция или не будет ее, во многом это зависит, конечно, от того, что будет с Россией. Если Россия сможет восстановить свою былую мощь, евразийская интеграция вполне реальный проект. Спасибо вам большое. Это была кафедра лекции на абхазском телевидении.